A Soviet soldier stands watch at the edge of a frozen forest in Finnish Karelia. The temperature has dropped to minus 40 degrees. His breath crystallizes the moment it leaves his mouth. Somewhere beyond the tree line, something moves. Or perhaps it was nothing at all. He strains his eyes against the endless white landscape, but sees only the snow-laden pines standing motionless like sentinels. Then, without warning, his comrade beside him slumps forward into the snow, a single hole through his head. No sound, no flash, no enemy, just death emerging from the frozen void. The surviving soldier scrambles for cover, screaming for help. His cries echo uselessly into the Arctic twilight. Around him, other men are falling, picked off one by an invisible force. Panic spreads through the ranks like wildfire. The Russians begin calling these attackers by the only name that makes sense: ghosts. White phantoms who appear from nowhere, strike with surgical precision, and vanish before anyone can return fire. To the Soviet soldiers freezing in Finnish territory in the winter of 1939, it seemed as if the very landscape itself had come alive to destroy them. This is not a ghost story. This is the story of the Finnish Winter War, one of the most remarkable David versus Goliath conflicts in modern military history. It is the story of how a nation of fewer than 4 million people held off the might of the Soviet Union's 500,000-strong invasion force. And it is the story of the ski soldiers, men so perfectly adapted to their environment, so masterful in their stealth and precision that their enemies genuinely believed they were facing something supernatural. The roots of this conflict stretched back decades to the complicated relationship between Finland and its enormous neighbor to the east. Finland had declared independence from Russia in 1917 in the chaos following the Bolshevik Revolution. For 2 decades, the young nation had worked to establish itself, building its institutions, training its military, and keeping a wary eye on the Soviet border. By the late 1930s, Joseph Stalin had grown increasingly concerned about the security of Leningrad, the Soviet Union's second-largest city, which sat dangerously close to Finnish territory. In his mind, the border needed to be pushed back to create a buffer zone. In the autumn of 1939, Soviet diplomats presented Finland with a series of demands. They wanted the Finns to move the border 25 kilometers back from Leningrad. They wanted a 30-year lease on the Hanko Peninsula for the construction of a Soviet naval base. They wanted Finland to destroy its own fortifications and essentially surrender its ability to defend its southern coast. The Finnish government, knowing that similar demands had been the prelude to Soviet occupation of the Baltic states, refused. Stalin was not a man accustomed to hearing the word no. As Nikita Khrushchev would later recall, the Soviet leadership believed that conquering Finland would be a simple matter. All they had to do was raise their voices a little, perhaps fire a single shot, and the Finns would surrender. The operation was expected to take 2 weeks at most, a mere police action against a tiny nation that possessed almost nothing in terms of modern military equipment. On November 30th, 1939, without a formal declaration of war, Soviet forces crossed the Finnish border. 21 divisions, totaling approximately 450,000 men, advanced into Finnish territory. They brought with them over 2,000 tanks, 3,000 aircraft, and thousands of artillery pieces. Behind them came the vast machinery of the Soviet war effort, supply trains, field hospitals, and enough ammunition to fight for months. Against this tidal wave of military might, Finland could muster approximately 340,000 soldiers, many of them reservists with outdated equipment. Their tank forces were essentially non-existent. Their air force consisted of perhaps 100 aircraft, only a dozen of which were modern fighters, the rest being slow biplanes from another era. They had so few functioning anti-tank guns that soldiers would have to improvise their own methods for stopping Soviet armor. Their stockpiles of ammunition would last only weeks. On paper, it should have been a massacre. The ratio of forces was almost laughably one-sided. The entire population of Finland numbered around 3 million people. The Soviet Union had 171 million. In manpower alone, the Soviets outnumbered the Finns by approximately 100 to 1. But wars are not fought on paper. They are fought in the mud and the snow, in the forests and the mountains, by men whose spirits cannot be measured by statistics. If you are finding this story compelling, consider subscribing to the channel. The tale of Finnish resistance is one of the most inspiring chapters of the 20th century, and there is much more to tell. The first thing the Soviet commanders discovered was that Finland was not Russia. The terrain that greeted their invasion force could not have been more unsuitable for conventional warfare. Finland is a land of almost 200,000 lakes, intersected by dozens of rivers, and covered with some of the densest forests in the world. What few roads existed were narrow, unpaved, and rarely interconnected. The thick forest and massive snowdrifts that flanked these roadways made lateral movement by foot or vehicle virtually impossible. For the Soviet forces, with their heavy tanks, artillery pieces, and motorized columns, this geography was a nightmare. Their massive convoys had no choice but to advance along the narrow roads, stretching out in long, vulnerable lines that snaked through the white wilderness. Once a column entered one of these forest roads, it had only two options: continue forward or retreat back. There was no going around obstacles, no maneuvering through the trees. The forest itself had become a wall. And then there was the weather. The winter of 1939 to 1940 was one of the harshest on record, even by Finnish standards. Temperatures regularly plunged to 30 and 40 degrees below zero. At these temperatures, exposed skin develops frostbite within minutes. Rifle mechanisms freeze, truck batteries die, lubricants and artillery pieces solidify. Every simple task of warfare becomes exponentially more difficult when the air itself seems to burn with cold. The Soviet soldiers who crossed the border were not prepared for this. Many arrived wearing their standard dark green uniforms, which stood out against the snow like ink blots on a white page. Some units were issued skis but given no training on how to use them. Other units received manuals on ski warfare but no actual skis. Their tanks and vehicles were painted in olive drab, making them visible from miles away. Their field kitchens used large chimneys that sent columns of smoke rising into the sky, announcing their positions to anyone watching. The Finns, by contrast, had been preparing for this war their entire lives. They had grown up in this frozen landscape. They had learned to ski almost before they could walk. They knew how to dress in layers of heavy woolen underwear, sweaters, multiple pairs of socks, and boots lined with reindeer fur. They knew to lubricate their rifles with a mixture of gasoline and gun oil that would not freeze. They knew to run their vehicles for 15 minutes every 2 hours to keep the engines from seizing. They knew to carry morphine in the warmth of their mouths or armpits so it would not freeze and become useless. Most importantly, they knew the forest, not as an obstacle, but as an ally. The Finnish military strategy was born from necessity. They knew they could not meet the Soviets in a conventional battle and expect to win. They lacked the artillery, the armor, the aircraft, and the manpower for that kind of warfare. Instead, they would fight a guerrilla war, using speed, stealth, and precision to overcome their disadvantages in firepower and numbers. At the heart of this strategy was the ski soldier. Finnish troops wore white snowsuits that made them virtually invisible against the winter landscape. They moved through the trackless forests on skis with a fluidity that no Soviet column could match. While the Russians were confined to their narrow roads, the Finns could appear from any direction at any time. They used reindeer to pull sleds carrying machine guns and mortars through the forests in near silence, moving equipment that would have required noisy trucks for the Soviets. Their method of attack was deceptively simple in concept, but devastating in execution. Finnish reconnaissance patrols would first locate a Soviet column moving along a forest road. They would gather intelligence on the column's length, its composition, the locations of its artillery and armor, and where its field kitchens were positioned. Then the attack would begin. The first phase was segmentation. Finnish ski troops would move ahead of the column and fell trees across the road, creating a roadblock that halted the Soviet advance. Simultaneously, other teams would create roadblocks behind the column, preventing retreat. The long line of Soviet troops and vehicles was now trapped in place, unable to move forward or backward through the dense forest on either side. Then came the mati tactic. The Finnish word mati refers to a cord of chopped firewood, a bundle of logs held in place by stakes, ready to be split into smaller pieces. This is precisely what the Finns did to the trapped Soviet columns. They would strike at the weakest points along the line, cutting the column into isolated segments. Each of these segments became its own mati, a pocket of enemy soldiers surrounded and cut off from support. Once a column was divided into matis, the real horror began for the Soviet soldiers inside them. The Finns would encircle each pocket, establishing their own command posts, supply depots, and camouflage dugouts in the surrounding forest. They then commenced a campaign of continuous harassment that ground down the trapped men through a combination of casualties, hunger, cold, and psychological terror. Small teams of Finnish ski soldiers would emerge from the forest at all hours, spraying the mati with submachine gun fire before vanishing back into the trees. Snipers targeted officers and non-commissioned officers, stripping the trapped soldiers of their leadership. Other snipers deliberately targeted men who gathered near campfires for warmth, making the life-giving flames into instruments of death. Soon the Soviet soldiers learned to fear the light as much as the darkness. At night, Finnish raiders conducted even more terrifying operations. They would blind the Soviets with lights before unleashing bursts of automatic fire and grenades into the confused mass of men. In some documented cases, Finnish soldiers crept into Soviet camps under cover of darkness and eliminated every other man in a group, leaving the survivors to wake up surrounded by the bodies of their comrades. The Finns specifically targeted the field kitchens, destroying the equipment that provided the trapped men with hot food. In temperatures of -40, calories were survival. Without hot meals, the starving soldiers weakened rapidly. Their bodies could not generate enough heat to stay warm. Frostbite ravaged their extremities. Men who were not eliminated by Finnish bullets died of cold and hunger, their frozen corpses left standing upright by the cold, like grotesque statues, marking the destruction of their units. Radio operators were among the priority targets, cutting off the matis from any communication with other Soviet units or with higher command. The isolation was complete. Trapped soldiers had no way to call for help, no way to coordinate with other pockets, no way to know whether rescue was coming. The psychological impact was devastating. Soviet troops reported shadows moving between the trees, phantom attackers that could not be seen or heard until the moment of death. They spoke of ghosts, white-clad specters who emerged from the snow itself, killed with supernatural accuracy, and disappeared before anyone could return fire. Sleep became impossible. Every rustle of wind through the pines might be the approach of death. Men who had marched into Finland confident of an easy victory now huddled together in terror, waiting for the next invisible strike. One report described how Finnish defenders occasionally took the frozen corpses of fallen Soviet soldiers and propped them upright in the snow, positioned facing the Soviet lines. These macabre scarecrows served as psychological warfare, a message to the living that death was coming for them too. Though such instances were rare, they contributed to the growing sense among Soviet troops that they were fighting something more than human. The Battle of Suomussalmi would demonstrate the mati tactic at its most devastating. This remote area in northern Finland was characterized by dense forests, numerous frozen lakes, and very few roads. It was exactly the terrain where Finnish strengths would be maximized and Soviet weaknesses exposed. In early December 1939, the Soviet 163rd Rifle Division crossed the border near Juntusranta, advancing westward with approximately 17,000 men. Their objective was to seize the village of Suomussalmi and then push through to the town of Oulu on the Gulf of Bothnia, effectively cutting Finland in half. The division moved quickly, capturing Suomussalmi village within days. But then their advance stalled. Stretched supply lines, poor reconnaissance, and the unfamiliar winter terrain left the 163rd Division increasingly vulnerable. Finnish ski patrols began their harassing attacks, destroying isolated elements piecemeal. The soldiers of the 163rd found themselves in a nightmare, unable to advance, increasingly short of supplies, and under constant attack from an enemy they could barely see. The Soviet High Command responded by sending reinforcements. The 44th Rifle Division, with approximately 17,500 men, along with tanks, artillery, and trucks, was ordered to advance along the Rate Road from the east to relieve the beleaguered 163rd. On paper, it was a formidable force. In reality, it was marching into a trap. The Rate Road was exactly the kind of narrow forest track that the Finns had learned to exploit. The 44th Division's convoy stretched out for nearly 20 kilometers, a long, vulnerable line hemmed in by dense forest and deep snow on both sides. The men could not leave the road. The vehicles could not maneuver off it. They were, in the Finnish term, firewood waiting to be chopped. The commander of Finnish forces in the sector was Colonel Hjalmar Silasvuo. His plan was brutally elegant: cut off the Soviet supply line to the Russian border, divide the column into mottes, and destroy each isolated segment in place. To enable this, Finnish engineers opened an improvised road over the frozen lakes south of the Rate Road, allowing Finnish forces to move and resupply parallel to the entire battle area while remaining invisible to the Soviets. Silasvuo's troops began with a pincer attack around the village of Haukila, striking from north and south simultaneously. They successfully cut the Rate Road east of Haukila, isolating the bulk of the 44th Division from the Soviet border. Then they blew up the Purasjoki River Bridge, effectively cutting the division in two. The 44th Division was now trapped in multiple segments, unable to receive supplies, reinforcements, or orders from higher command. Over the following days, Finnish ski troops systematically eliminated each motte. The smaller and weaker segments were destroyed first. Larger pockets were starved and frozen into submission before being overrun. Soviet soldiers who tried to flee through the forest were hunted down by ski patrols. Those who surrendered were taken prisoner. Those who resisted were eliminated. By January 8, 1940, the annihilation was complete. The 44th Rifle Division had ceased to exist as a fighting force. Finnish casualties in the combined battles of Suomussalmi and Rate Road numbered approximately 900 killed and 1,170 wounded. Soviet casualties are estimated at over 22,000 killed or frozen to death, with approximately 2,100 taken prisoner. The Finns captured an enormous quantity of military equipment: 43 tanks, 71 field guns, 29 anti-tank guns, 260 trucks, 170 horses, and thousands of rifles and machine guns. It was one of the most lopsided victories in modern military history, achieved by a force that was outnumbered roughly 2-1 against each Soviet division separately. The motte tactic had proven devastatingly effective, but the Finnish resistance was not only about tactics and terrain, it was also about individual warriors whose skill and courage became legendary. None would become more famous than a small, quiet farmer from the village of Rautajärvi named Simo Haiha. Haiha stood only 5 feet 3 inches tall, an unassuming figure who had spent his adult life farming and hunting in the forests of southern Finland. He had completed his mandatory military service in the 1920s, where he had trained as a marksman. The skills he developed hunting in the Finnish wilderness would soon be turned against a very different kind of prey. When the Soviet invasion began, Heha reported for duty with the Finnish 34th Infantry Regiment. He was assigned to the front near Kola, a sector of the line that would see some of the war's most intense fighting. From his first day in combat, Heha demonstrated a gift for the sniper's craft that bordered on the supernatural. He dressed entirely in white, blending seamlessly into the snow-covered landscape. He preferred to work alone, finding his own hiding spots among the drifts and the trees. He used a Finnish-produced M2830 rifle, a variant of the motionless that the Finns had refined for accuracy. Unusually for a sniper, he refused to use a telescopic sight. The glass could fog in the cold, he reasoned, and the lens might catch the sun and give away his position. Instead, he relied on the rifle's iron sights, keeping his profile low against the snow and eliminating any reflective surface that might betray him. His methods were meticulous. He would scout his position beforehand, compacting the snow in front of his firing spot so that the muzzle blast would not kick up a telltale cloud of white powder. He put snow in his mouth before aiming so that his breath would not create visible vapor. He lay motionless for hours, waiting for targets to present themselves, conserving his energy and his ammunition until the perfect moment. And when that moment came, he did not miss. During his training in the Army, Heha had demonstrated the ability to hit a target 150 meters away, up to 16 times per minute. In combat, working at much greater ranges, his accuracy remained extraordinary. Day after day, Soviet soldiers walking along the front lines would suddenly collapse, struck down by a bullet that seemed to come from nowhere. Bodies piled up along the marching routes, frozen in their last moments before being hit. Sometimes entire positions were found deserted of the living, but filled with corpses, frozen in whatever positions they had been in when death found them. On December 21, 1939, Heha set a personal record, eliminating 25 Soviet soldiers in a single day. His total continued to climb as the weeks passed. 100, 200, 300. Word of the invisible sniper spread through the Soviet ranks. They began calling him Belaya Smrt, the White Death. The Soviets tried everything to stop him. They deployed counter-snipers to find and eliminate the ghost who was terrorizing their forces. Heha killed them too. One story describes a Soviet sniper who waited all day for the White Death to reveal himself, staring through his telescopic sight at the frozen landscape. As the sun set and the Soviet sniper began to relax, thinking he had survived another day, Heha shot him through the head. The White Death had been watching him the entire time, waiting for the moment of complacency. Artillery barrages were called in on areas where Heha was suspected to be operating. He simply moved to new positions and continued his work. Soviet soldiers began carrying large iron shields into the field, hoping to protect themselves from the sniper they could not see. It made no difference. The bullets kept coming. The legend of the White Death spread beyond the front lines, becoming a source of fear and despair throughout the Soviet forces in Finland. It was said that he was a ghost, that he was everywhere and nowhere, that he could not be seen or heard until the moment of death. For Finnish troops, he became a symbol of their resistance, proof that one man with skill and determination could make a difference against impossible odds. By late February 1940, Heha had been fighting continuously for nearly 100 days. His confirmed kill count had passed 500, making him the deadliest sniper in recorded history. But on March 6th, his war would come to a sudden and violent end. The Soviets had launched a renewed offensive against the Finnish positions at Kola, throwing fresh troops against the exhausted defenders. Haiha was fighting with regular infantry that day, his sniper rifle set aside as he engaged the enemy at close range. In the chaos of the battle, he was struck in the jaw by an explosive bullet, a type of ammunition banned by international law since the 1800s, but used nonetheless by Soviet forces. The bullet ripped apart his lower face. Haiha collapsed into the snow, his mouth filled with blood and bone fragments. His comrades dragged him from the fighting and rushed him to a field hospital. He fell into a coma that would last for weeks. When he finally regained consciousness, the war was over, and doctors had reconstructed his shattered face as best they could. He would spend the rest of his long life with a disfigured jaw, a permanent reminder of his time as the White Death. In fewer than 100 days of active combat, Simo Haiha had eliminated over 500 enemy soldiers with his rifle alone. When his kills with a submachine gun are included, the total may have exceeded 700. No sniper before or since has matched his record. He was promoted, decorated, and proclaimed a hero of Finland. When asked in later interviews about his incredible achievement, Haiha was characteristically modest. He had simply done what he was told, he said. He had done his duty. The White Death was the most famous of the Finnish snipers, but he was far from alone. The Finnish ranks were filled with men who had grown up hunting in these forests, who could hit a target at 1,000 meters with their first shot. These marksmen made every bullet count, turning economy of force into an art form. Finnish anti-aircraft gunners demonstrated similarly remarkable efficiency, achieving 1 kill for every 54 rounds of cannon fire, a ratio that astounded military observers. This precision was born of necessity. Finland simply did not have ammunition to waste. Every shell, every bullet, every grenade had to be used to maximum effect. While the Soviets could fire thousands of rounds in suppressing fire, the Finns made each shot a calculated decision. It was an approach that demanded skill, patience, and discipline, qualities that the Finnish military possessed in abundance. The shortage of conventional weapons also sparked remarkable improvisation. The most famous innovation was the Molotov cocktail. While the Finns did not invent the petrol bomb, they refined it into a devastatingly effective weapon against Soviet armor. Finnish chemists improved the basic formula, adding kerosene, tar, and potassium chlorate to create a more explosive mixture. They attached windproof matches or chemical vials to the bottles, allowing them to ignite on impact without requiring a pre-lit wick. The name itself was a piece of psychological warfare. When the Soviet Air Force bombed Helsinki on the first day of the war, Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov claimed that Russian planes were dropping not bombs, but food and humanitarian aid to the starving Finnish people. The Finns, who were neither starving nor amused, began calling the bombs Molotov's breadbaskets. The incendiary bottles they threw back became Molotov cocktails, a drink to accompany the food. The dark humor helped sustain morale while the weapons themselves stopped dozens of Soviet tanks. The Finns set booby traps with creative malice. Mines were concealed in haystacks attached to cupboard doors, hidden under outhouse seats, placed beneath dead chickens and abandoned sleds. Village wells were poisoned or fouled. Pipe mines, steel tubes packed with explosives and detonated by tripwires, were buried in snowdrifts set to explode at waist height and cause horrific wounds. Under frozen lakes, partially filled mines were suspended on ropes, designed not to destroy tanks, but to shatter the ice beneath them. When word of this spread, Soviet tank commanders began avoiding the lakes entirely, which was exactly what the Finns wanted since it forced armor into the forests where ambushes were easier. On some lakes, the Finns unrolled enormous sheets of cellophane so that from the air they would appear unfrozen and impassable. The Soviets would not even attempt to cross, never knowing they were being fooled by a sheet of plastic. The brutal conditions of the war affected both sides, but they affected the Soviets far more severely. While the Finns had trained specifically for winter warfare in Finnish terrain, the Red Army had prepared for operations on the open steppes of Russia. Their equipment was designed for different conditions. Their soldiers lacked the skills and the clothing to survive Arctic temperatures. The number of Soviet troops who froze to death during the Winter War is unknown, but it was enormous. In one recorded case, nearly 10,000 soldiers were evacuated from a single sector due to frostbite before any major combat had occurred. Men who fell asleep in the cold never woke up. The wounded, unable to move, froze where they lay. Bodies accumulated faster than they could be collected, creating macabre fields of frozen corpses that the living had to navigate on their way to the front. The cold attacked the Soviet war machine as thoroughly as it attacked the soldiers. Lubricants in tanks and artillery pieces froze solid. Vehicle engines seized up. Artillery recoil systems failed. The fluid inside them turned to ice. Fuses in shells became unreliable, with some rounds failing to detonate and others exploding prematurely. Trucks could not operate in the deep snow, leaving supplies stuck miles behind the front lines. Horses that might have compensated for the trucks had not been brought in sufficient numbers. Finnish equipment was simply better suited to the conditions. Their infantry tents came with portable stoves. Their uniform tunics were designed for layering. Their horses, while slower and carrying less than trucks, could move through snow where vehicles bogged down. And their soldiers knew how to maintain their weapons, their vehicles, and themselves in temperatures that paralyzed their enemies. The Finns also understood the importance of morale, the psychological dimension of warfare that statistics cannot capture. They rotated their ski troops regularly between frontline duty and rest behind the lines, ensuring that no unit became too exhausted to fight effectively. The schedule called for 2 hours of patrolling, 2 hours of rest in a warm dugout, then 2 more hours of activity, followed by 4 hours for sleeping and eating. Every few days, if fighting permitted, each man received time in one of the frontline saunas. Even in combat, the Finns maintained their cultural traditions of cleanliness and heat. The dugouts where Finnish soldiers rested were remarkably comfortable, given the circumstances. They were lined with animal furs and skins, covered with straw and handmade blankets, heated by stoves and protected by camouflaged log roofs. While Soviet soldiers shivered around campfires that made them targets for snipers, Finnish troops recovered in warm, hidden shelters before returning to the fight. The food was different, too. While the Soviets subsisted on black bread and unsweetened tea, nowhere near enough calories to maintain body heat in Arctic conditions, the Finns ate hot, substantial meals that kept them physically healthy and mentally resilient. An army marches on its stomach, as the saying goes, and the Finnish stomach was far better supplied than the Soviet one. All of this contributed to a Finnish quality that cannot be easily translated, but defines their national character, sisu. The word encompasses stoic determination, grit, bravery, tenacity, and resilience. It is the willingness to take on challenges that seem beyond one's capacity, to hold on when everything says to give up. Sisu is what allowed Finnish soldiers to approach Soviet tanks on foot, armed only with Molotov cocktails and satchel charges, knowing that the casualty rate for such attacks was 70%. It is what inspired Finnish pilots to fly obsolete biplanes against formations of modern Soviet fighters that outnumbered them 20-1, and shoot down 10 times as many aircraft as they lost. Sisu was particularly visible along the Mannerheim Line, the system of fortifications that stretched across the Karelian Isthmus in southern Finland. Named for Field Marshal Carl Gustaf Emil Mannerheim, the commander of Finnish forces, the line was Finland's main defense against a direct Soviet advance toward Helsinki. Here, the guerrilla tactics of the ski soldiers could not be fully employed. Here, the Finns had to make a more conventional stand against overwhelming Soviet firepower. In February 1940, Stalin grew impatient with the pace of the war. He committed massive reinforcements to the assault on the Mannerheim Line, 460,000 troops, over 3,250 artillery pieces, 3,000 tanks, and 1,300 aircraft. The bombardment that followed was one of the most intense in military history to that point. Soviet shells rained down on Finnish positions with such fury that the shock waves concussed men's brains and collapsed their dugouts, burying soldiers alive. The Finns held. Position after position was overrun, but the defenders fell back to secondary lines and continued fighting. When their ammunition ran low, they fought with Molotov cocktails and grenades taped together into improvised satchel charges. When hand-to-hand combat erupted, they fought with knives and fists. The defense was costing Finland enormously. Casualties mounted daily, and there were no reserves left to plug the gaps. But they refused to break. By early March, the situation had become untenable. The Finnish army was exhausted, its ammunition nearly depleted, its defensive positions crumbling under the relentless Soviet assault. On March 12, 1940, Finland signed the Moscow Peace Treaty ending the Winter War. The terms were harsh. Finland ceded more territory than the Soviets had originally demanded, including all of Karelia, a significant portion of the country's industrial capacity, and the homes of over 400,000 Finnish citizens who would become refugees. But Finland survived. Unlike the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, which had accepted Soviet demands and were ultimately absorbed into the USSR, Finland maintained its independence. The country had lost land, but it had not lost its sovereignty. The Red Army had captured territory, but it had not conquered the Finnish spirit. The cost of the war was staggering for both sides, but especially for the Soviet Union. Finnish casualties totaled approximately 70,000 killed or wounded. Soviet casualties were catastrophic. Estimates range from 350,000 to over 400,000 killed, wounded, or missing. The disparity is almost incomprehensible, given the imbalance in resources. A tiny nation with antiquated equipment had inflicted 5 times as many casualties as it suffered against the world's largest military. The Winter War exposed critical weaknesses in the Soviet military that would have consequences far beyond Finland. The Red Army's performance was so poor that it encouraged Adolf Hitler in his belief that the Soviet Union could be quickly defeated. When German forces invaded the USSR in June 1941, they expected to encounter the same incompetent enemy that Finland had humiliated. They were partially correct. The early months of Operation Barbarossa saw the destruction of Soviet armies on an unprecedented scale. But the Soviets learned from their failures, reformed their military, and eventually ground the German war machine to dust. For Finland, the lessons of the Winter War would be applied again during the continuation war of 1941-1944, when the country allied with Germany against the Soviet Union in an attempt to recover lost territory. The ski soldiers returned to the forests, and the Mahti tactics that had worked so well in 1939 were employed again. But the Soviets had learned too. They sent soldiers equipped with skis and white camouflage, trained for winter warfare. The second conflict would be longer, bloodier, and end in another difficult peace. The legacy of the Finnish Winter War extends far beyond the snowy forests where it was fought. Military academies around the world still study the Mahti tactics as a textbook example of how a smaller force can defeat a larger one through superior mobility, terrain exploitation, and psychological warfare. The Winter War demonstrated that technology and numbers are not decisive by themselves, that human factors like training, morale, and leadership can overcome material disadvantages. For Finland, the war became a defining moment of national identity. The sisu displayed by ordinary Finns in the face of impossible odds remains a source of pride. Simo Heha, the White Death, became a national hero whose story is still told to Finnish children. The battles of Suomussalmi and Rata Road are commemorated as examples of what free men can accomplish when they fight for their homeland. And for the Soviet soldiers who survived the war, the memories were haunted by something they could never quite explain. They had faced an enemy they could not see, could not catch, could not defeat. They had experienced the terror of the Mahdi, trapped and freezing, while invisible assailants picked them off one by one. They had learned to fear the white-clad ghosts who emerged from the forest, struck with deadly precision, and vanished before retribution could be delivered. These were not supernatural beings. They were farmers and loggers, teachers and craftsmen, ordinary Finnish citizens who had learned to ski before they could walk, who knew their forests like the backs of their hands, who refused to surrender their freedom without a fight. They moved in silence because they had spent their lives moving through snow. They struck with precision because they had grown up as hunters. They disappeared into the landscape because that landscape was their home. The ghosts of the Finnish Winter War were men, but they were men who had transformed themselves into something their enemies could not comprehend. Soldiers so perfectly adapted to their environment, so masterful in the arts of stealth and survival, that they seemed to transcend the limitations of ordinary warfare. In the frozen darkness of the Arctic winter, facing a foe that outnumbered them 100 to 1, they found within themselves a strength that no tank, no artillery piece, no aircraft could defeat. They found their Sisu, and with it they held.